Hey, in this video we're going to be talking about homogeneous coordinates. That's a pretty fancy name, but just keep in mind that it is a mathematical tool to help us do the kinds of transformations that we need in games. So, we have seen a translation matrix. Let me use dx here. dy, dz. And this is a 4x4 matrix. And we saw that this was necessary in order to represent translations in 3 dimensions. So this is not a 4-dimensional construct. We're not representing an extra spatial dimension with a 4x4 matrix. We could, but when we're talking about translation matrices and transforms and such, this extra column here and this extra row at the bottom is not an extra spatial dimension, it's just an additional mathematical tool. And this is the homogeneous column and the homogeneous row, so we have an extra coordinate added onto our 3 other coordinates. So normally 3D and we just add 1, kind of like 3D plus 1, right? We can call it that. So let's say that any specific 3D point needs to have 4 coordinates. So let's say we have a vector, and I'm going to say it has an x, a y, a z, and a w. And then let's just say, and go along with me here, that any specific 3D point, a point that represents a real 3D position in space, has to have a w of exactly 1. So if we define it this way, then when we have something that is not 1 for our w coordinate, we need to have a process to turn it back into 1 so that we can represent a real 3D point. So if I go through a matrix multiplication, there might be cases when I have something else in that bottom row that changes what my w coordinate ends up being. It's not always going to be 1, but I want it to eventually be 1 so that it can represent a 3D point. So let's define something that helps us normalize this. We'll call this homogeneous normalization. We need to make any vector that is x, y, z, and some other value, let's say w. We need to turn this into the x, y, z. Let's make these primes because they could be different. And we want a w of exactly 1. So we want to do this kind of operation that does this. So homogeneous normalization is the step we need to take here. That's an I. Alright, so to do this, we are really just dividing by w. That's all it is. You want to turn w into 1, well, divide it by w. So let's divide all of our coordinates by w, essentially multiplying this vector by 1 divided by w. So we get this v prime, that's going to be x divided by w, y divided by w, and z divided by w, and then 1. So these are our x prime, our y prime, and our z prime, to end up with a normalized point in space that we can actually use. Alright, so what's cool about this is that if you take any old vector, let's say we have 2, 4, 1, and then we give it a w value, let's say a w value of 1. This we can plot. We can plot this in 3D space. We can say, okay, well, it's got, it's 2 along this axis, it's 4 along this, whichever axis we're doing for y. Let's say, let's do math coordinates, I guess. So 4 along this axis, and then 1 along the z-axis. All right, so we end up with a point that is over somewhere over here. It's going to be hard to kind of really visualize that, but we would plot it in 3D, and then yeah, there we go, that's better. So we have a point in space. Now let's adjust the w coordinate and see what this does. So let's say we had a point 2, 4, 1, 2. After normalizing this, we're going to end up with a point, let's see, we have to divide everything by 2. So 1, 2, 0.5, 1. Right? So everything got divided by 2. That means everything got closer to the origin. As your w increases, it's kind of scaling down these points, all of your points, if you're using this w, toward the origin. And then going the opposite way, let's say we have a point that is 2, 4, 1, 0.5. Dividing by 0.5 is going to mean doubling everything. So we'll end up with 4, 8, 2, 1. And this is going to be a point that's farther away from the origin. So now let's keep going with this. Let's say we have a point 2, 4, 1, 0.25. So this is going to normalize to be 8, 16, 4, 1. So everything is being multiplied by 4. And you'll notice as we get smaller and smaller, closer and closer to 0, these numbers are getting bigger and bigger. They're getting farther and farther away. And no matter what we do and change our w coordinate, we are essentially defining a line. We're defining a line of possibility here, where there could be an infinite number of points along this line, and the only difference between them is their w coordinate. So adding this additional dimension sort of thing, this extra w, has us defining a line instead of a point using these 4 coordinates. So that's kind of cool. But we need to keep going further in order to find out what this means. Because if we go further and further, 0.25, 0.125, lower and lower and lower, let's go to the extreme. What if we wrote a valid coordinate like this, where we have a 0 as our w value? We cannot really normalize this. If we were to normalize this, right, what's 2 divided by 0? I don't know, infinity maybe? 4 divided by 0, 1 divided by 0. So these things, they don't really have an answer. There's no definite answer for just doing that math. There is no way to really arrive at this normalization step. But we can still write this coordinate. So it must mean something, right? If you are just dividing by 0, that's not going to work. But if you are approaching 0, if you're starting off somewhere and you're going closer and closer and closer to 0, then these numbers are just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger in whatever direction they're pointing. And that is going to tend toward infinity. So this simple expression of 4 coordinates is actually giving us the ability to describe a point that is infinitely far away. That's pretty cool. That means we can talk about vanishing points. We can have all of these lines that kind of tend toward infinity, and we can have objects fade off into the distance. This is a perspective projection that I'm talking about. So this is just not at all possible with 3 coordinates. We can't do x, y, and z and say, well, y is infinity, and expect that to actually work in our calculations. It's just not going to work. So having this extra mathematical component on our vectors gives us this additional ability to talk about infinity. And that is really, really cool. So now let's talk about the perspective example. Pretend that we have a camera, and this camera is pointing along down the z-axis. That means just let's set up another 3D coordinate system, right? Something like this. If you were looking along the direction that this camera is pointing, z is forward, x is to your right, y is up, and then negative x is to your left. Let's center it on the z-axis, so on the origin, so that the positive x is off to the right of center and the negative x is off to the left of center. So now let's look at the simplest possible perspective projection matrix that we can come up with. Try this one. It's going to look a lot like the identity matrix. We're going to try to keep it simple. Alright, oop, did I make a mistake? No. The z dimension right here, 0. That's crazy. I kind of moved it down into this last row. All right. Now this isn't going to mean anything until we actually do the math. What happens when we transform a vector by this? So let me call this P for perspective or projection, and let me do P times some vector. So if my vector was something like x, y, z, and let's see, do we want, I'll just do 1 there. Okay, so multiplying these through, we get a vector x, we get y, we get in this row, everything cancels out, so we end up with 0 for our z-coordinate. And then in the last one, we end up with z. Okay. Alright, so now we've got this vector, x, y, 0, z. Let's normalize it. Using our homogeneous normalization, we want to divide everything by that w coordinate, which is the value z. So x divided by z, y divided by z, 0 still, and then 1. Great. So now it represents a real 3D point we can work with. If I do this to every point in a piece of geometry or an entire scene or world, notice my z value is 0. So everything is squished down right in front of the camera. It is at the z-coordinate 0. So that means I've kind of turned everything into 2 dimensions. There's no more third dimension. And to go along with that, in addition, I have divided my x by the z and my y by the z. So the larger my z-coordinate is, the smaller my new x-coordinate is, and the smaller my new y-coordinate is. In other words, as z increases, remember we're at a camera looking down the z-axis, so big z values mean that they are farther away from the camera. This means that the farther away you are from the camera, the smaller your x and y values are going to be. So this is kind of scaling things down as they get farther away, right? these points are going to get closer and closer to the origin or the vanishing axis or whatever. We're going to end up having a vanishing point where the farther you go away from the camera, the smaller these objects become. So that is a perspective. We have successfully transformed points to cause a kind of three-dimensional perspective effect and flatten them down on a two-dimensional surface, and then that can be displayed to our user. That's pretty cool. So it is this is kind of magical if you think about it. It's very cool that just adding this additional dimension, this extra W coordinate to our vectors and to our matrices allows us to talk about infinity, and that in turn allows us to create a perspective effect. It's not possible without it, unless you cheat a little, but this is a very mathematical and reproducible, consistent way to do it. All right, in the next video we will talk further about projections. We'll talk about a more complete perspective projection, the one that's actually used in computer graphics, a far throw from this simple one, and we will talk about orthographic projections as well. I'll see you then.